Thanks for having me here. Been working on this stuff since I was a graduate student here at Chicago. And actually a lot of the work I'm going to talk about is co-authored with a fellow graduate student of mine who's a macroeconomist, now at the St. Louis Fed. Full disclosure, I'm more of a labor economist. And I'm going to start off on territory I know pretty well in this talk, and at the very end of this afternoon, I'm going to be in territory I know less about, but I'm learning stuff I knew better as a graduate student and forgot. Learn a lot about depreciation of skills over time. But my co-author knows a lot more about it, so if you're going to if the questions get really hard, I'll have to give you his email address and send you to him. Some of you guys might know more about it. You know, if there's any theorists in here or people working on mechanism design, it might all be true. The later stuff might be obvious to you, but I don't think it's going to be obvious to everyone. It wasn't obvious to me anyway. So I think it goes without saying that sort of thinking about education and human capital are sort of central to thinking about individual and economy-wide development. I try to think about how do I want to motivate what I'm going to talk about, and I kind of think of two ways to motivate it. And here's probably the better way, and I want to give you the way I have been motivating it as well. And this is just, we spend a lot of money on education. This is just... And it's been growing like crazy. So this is from the Digest of Education Statistics. I just looked at this yesterday. And this is just expenditures on students for post-secondary. If you look at public institutions and private institutions, and it's in constant dollars. So you see this sort of rapid increase. It's basically tripled. This is for private institutions, for-profit and not-for-profit, and public institutions. Both of these lines have basically tripled since around 1980. And we're spending, if you add these two lines up, you get about $425 billion a year. And that's just sort of direct expenditures. That's not counting all the opportunity costs that you guys are, all the work you guys are giving up by sitting in the classroom. So you're probably talking something like on the order of $1 trillion a year being spent just on higher education. What we want to, and it's grown like crazy over just the last couple of decades. The question is, what's the right way to, sort of the big question that we're not going to answer, and there isn't an answer to out there yet, I don't think, is how do we want to structure the payments for that? The government has a hand in it, and individuals themselves have a hand in it. The government's involved in all sorts of ways, direct subsidies to institutions, in terms of public universities. It plays a huge role in financial aid, need-based financial aid. Even in some states, it's playing a role in merit-based financial aid. Institutions are sort of moving money around, taking high tuition in from some guys and subsidizing other guys. And individuals, of course, are paying lots of money. So the question is, I think the big question, maybe in another 10 years, I'll sort of have an answer I'm happy with, is what's the right way to structure all that? Especially given how much money is going towards it. The smaller question I want to talk more today about is, given whatever we decided to subsidize and pay already, how do we want to finance, how do we want to help individuals finance it themselves in terms of lending? Are students able to borrow enough to go? And if not, should we be giving more out? Who should we be giving more out? These types of questions. I'll kind of end at the end. There's lots of, I think this is kind of a fun topic to talk about with a bunch of students, because I think sort of there's a whole range of interesting topics to be worked out. And there's a lot of theses that could be written on this, and hopefully a lot of good papers. And we hope to write a few ourselves, but I think there's way more than we could possibly write, even if that's all I did all day. So it's clear that how we decide to finance it, who we decide to give the money to and encourage to go to school, is going to have sort of dramatic effects on all sorts of things in terms of thinking about social mobility, providing transfers to low-income families or subsidies, need-based aid. The whole goal is to help provide greater social mobility, the distribution of income at any given point in time, thinking about economic growth and development, sort of how much we want to subsidize it is going to be important. And that, crucial to thinking about sort of the financing of these issues is the sort of the access to credit people have. School costs a lot of money, and typically you have to pay that money up front, and you don't get any of the returns down the road. So it leads to a natural question of how do we sort of help people smooth that income over time, given there's sort of lots of problems that arise in that world. So that's one way to kind of think about the overall picture of what I want to talk about. A different way, often when I give this paper or start talking about these issues, I hear someone, I guess Jim just left, but I hear someone almost always says, well, didn't Jim and Pedro and co-authors already say credit constraints aren't important in education? So why are you wasting our time showing us all these models and messing around and some calibration? What's that?
That's why I had to leave. He was so outraged.
Yeah. No, I actually could think I even convinced him that it's a worthwhile endeavor, which is not always easy when he starts from a different point. And to that I always say, I think they're exactly right. When you looked at the NLSY 79, which is what they looked at, and a number of other studies look at, and I'll talk a little bit about it, it doesn't look like credit constraints could possibly be that important in terms of determining who goes to college. We could debate exactly about how much, but family income wasn't that related to college going. A bunch of studies looking at it a different way showed there's not really much impact of family income or any role for constraints are likely to be small. Curiously, those studies are all coming out around the early 2000s. A few years ago, we went and looked at the NLSY 97 cohort data, and we started finding all kinds of different findings from what they found. Then we said, well, let's do exactly what they did as best we can and see if we kind of get something out. And what we were finding there, and I'll show you, is that family income matters a lot more for these most recent cohorts. So these are students going to college in the 2000s. Now you look at family income or you look at wealth, it has, even when you condition on ability and do the same types of things Carniero and Heckman did, you find family income's pretty important for who goes to college. And the more you think about it, the more obvious it becomes that that shouldn't really be that surprising. Yep?
There's just two ways to think about credit constraints being important. One is that I just literally do not have enough resources to pay my tuition. The other one is I just can't smooth my life cycle with consultants. Which one are we thinking about?
Well, I want to think about, I want to tell you that the latter is probably the better way to think about it. That is, I'm going to be very explicit about it. I'm going to go probably more explicit than maybe you guys all want me to be, going through sort of a very simple framework of how to think about it. And I think a lot of people naively think you only have to worry about constraints if you can't finance the costs. So if school costs $3,000, everybody can borrow $3,000. So of course borrowing constraints can't be a problem. But I think you want to take a broader picture, and that is people do want to smooth their income. I don't want to live on ramen noodles. I may not want to live on ramen noodles for 4 years, not have a car, not be able to do anything. And I still might, if the payoff's high enough, I still might go to college and take that bet. But there's a lot of people where the payoff still may be positive, but they might not want to take that on. And I think that's the broader way you want to think about borrowing constraints. Now there's a question of whether borrowing constraints affect, what dimensions they affect behavior. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about evidence, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about theory, kind of a little bit of everything in the talk. Yep?
Kind of building on Brent slightly. To what extent are we going to think about today the fact of credit constraints on the cost benefit analysis that people do? Right? Like say, for example, if I have some threshold rule for going to college or not, right? And this credit constraint actually pushes me across the threshold. So in absolute terms, the credit constraint itself may not be binding, but it's kind of maybe right, but it may actually push me across this decision threshold. Are we going to think about that in terms of the cost benefit analysis?
I'm going to talk about whether constraints distort decisions. If they distort decisions, by definition, they're going to distort utility, I guess. well, I don't know by definition, but it's hard to think of a case where it wouldn't, unless people are indifferent between sort of different choices. But the problem I'm going to set up, you know, if it causes you to make a different decision, it's going to be distorting. You know, if we could magically erase that credit constraint, there would be an efficiency gain. So a lot of the first part of this talk is going to be about, we're not going to talk about where these constraints come from. We're just going to sort of take them as is and think about how they distort decisions, whether we can measure them, how people have tried to measure their role in the education sector and human capital accumulation. We'll talk a little bit, and then later probably this afternoon, I'm going to talk more about where do these constraints come from and how should we think about these constraints in different types of environments. They weren't that different. Well, I mean, I hesitate to call the gap in family gap in college attendance by family income. I hesitate to call that a measure of borrowing constraints. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think it's informative about it potentially, but those gaps in particular are not that different for blacks and whites in the NLSY 97. I don't know. People haven't done looked at the borrowing constraints in a lot of other ways in the NLSY 97 that they did. So the NLSY 79 is nice because people have kind of taken a bunch of different approaches and looked at it. And there they always find sort of constraints aren't that important, with one caveat that I'll be clear about.
I was curious because of the differential as well.
Yeah, so I guess when I say that I was saying by income gaps, but you would have more low income blacks than you would whites. So to the extent that even if there's nothing sort of different about blacks versus whites conditional on their income and ability in terms of, that's I guess what I would say. Yep.
These overall trends you're presenting, to what extent are they specific to the US or do they extend beyond that?
Oh, I don't. Costs are going up pretty much everywhere. I know in Canada they're going up. I've got some, we've done some things on Canada. It's sort of an interesting question of what's driving the costs increasing. And I would suspect it has a lot to do with the rise in earnings for higher educated workers relative to low educated workers. And to the extent where you see that taking place, that's probably going on in most of these countries. I mean, the US is a lot less, you know, you go to a lot of Latin American countries or European countries, the students themselves don't pay much of the cost. England, that's not entirely true, but at least now. But that doesn't mean the costs aren't there. And I don't know the cost numbers across these countries. My guess is they're higher in the US than they are in a lot of these countries because it's a bit more deregulated. But I would be shocked. I would be really surprised if they weren't going up everywhere. Probably not as much as they are in the US, but I don't know the answer to that. All right, you guys are a talkative bunch. That's great. So here's the other way I kind of motivated this, and it's along these lines. It's that, and it comes back to what I was saying is, it looks like, you know, family income's more important. I'm kind of bouncing all over the place here, sorry. We started thinking, what's the economics behind that? And indeed, if you just sort of said, I have no idea what the data look like, but here are some trends that happen in terms, or I have no idea about whether people are borrowing constrained or not, or I don't have any data on that. And you said, you know, what are the big trends some of the big trends that have happened in education? And how might that affect whether people are having a harder time financing it or not? And what, you know, there's two or three big trends, and that is the returns to college, returns to education more generally have sort of skyrocketed since the early 80s. That's not on this graph. But also the costs have gone up like crazy since the early 80s. And again, I think those two are probably linked tightly just by the fact that universities hire a lot of educated workers. And these two, you know, the two red lines, the top one is for private four-year schools. This lower red one is for private or for public two-year schools. These are, you know, sort of adjusting for inflation. You see the costs going up, the returns going up. At the same time, all these blue lines are different measures of how much you can borrow from the federal student loan system. And sort of to make a long story short, over all those years, basically, If you look in the early 80s versus the early 2000s, the amount you can borrow from the federal student loan system in real dollars hasn't changed at all. On the other hand, the costs have gone up a lot and the returns have gone up a lot. Think about it for a few minutes. If that's the only access to credit people have, you would expect a lot more people to be up against the limits. The costs going up means you want to borrow more, and the returns going up also means you want to borrow more, because you want to borrow against all that money you're going to make later on. Well, indeed, that's exactly what you see if you look at sort of how many people are borrowing as much as they can from the Stafford Loan Program. Going just back to 1990, it was almost nobody was borrowing as much as they could. 4%, again, consistent with back in 1980, constraints probably weren't that much of a problem. On the other hand, if you just look 10 years later, a quarter of all undergraduates, dependent undergraduates, I don't know, there's a long caveat there, but a quarter of all these undergraduates at four-year public schools were borrowing the maximum. If you just look like, I think if you look, the most recent data, it's about 30%. So now there's sort of a lot of students up against the limits. About half of all students don't borrow, and then among those that borrow, around half or over half are up against the limits. Yep?
Can you speak up, please?
Oh, sorry.
By what dimension? She's asking what type of students borrow more?
No, well, because it changed, so like what type of students started borrowing and types of borrowing?
Well, it's low-income students, primarily low and middle-income students. You know, I mean, it's going to be, I'll show you a few numbers on that. And I'm going to show you a little bit of, I'll show you a few numbers about what sort of the current system looks like. And that will maybe help answer a little bit of there. Yep?
What about non-students? Are non-students borrowing more?
I mean, one of the things I'm going to tell you shortly, well, this afternoon, is talking about the way to think about borrowing constraints is the government lets you borrow to go to school. They don't provide a lot of credit to you if you're not going to school. And that's going to turn out, I think, to be important for thinking about some of this stuff. I don't know. I mean, so this would, I mean, the non-students would be basically, we'd be talking about credit cards, at least if you're talking sort of young people in their 20s. And I suspect that's gone up, but I don't know how much that amount has changed over time. I mean, we're not as worried about the non-students being as credit constrained. I mean, they're borrowing against life cycle income, and their income is going to go up. But their income profiles are a lot flatter than someone who's going to college and earns almost nothing and then is going to have a higher earnings afterwards. So these guys still might be constrained, and we still might want to think about you know, the fact that even if you're not going to college or spending a lot of money on school, you might be borrowing constraint. But I think the problem is just heightened considerably when you start thinking about going to school as well at the same time. Yep.
Can we do a decomposition of this in terms of like how much of this is increases on the intensive margin versus like extensive margin? Do you have like people who would have been going to school anyway now borrowing more because it costs more? Or do you have people who have not been able to go to school previously, but because returns are so much higher, they're opting?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. So how much of this is due to drawing in new people that now, yeah, I don't know the answer to that. College enrollment is going up over this period, although I'll show you some graphs. College enrollment is not going up very much for low income people in the bottom half of the ability distribution. So I'll show you a little bit about that, and that might speak to that somewhat. But I don't know anyone that's tried to decompose this. That's a hard question. It's a good one, though.
Yeah, this could be a good thing, right? The fact that now more people are using this facility than people who would not have otherwise gone to school because the facility exists. They do something that they need for that. So this is like. Sure,
it's not. The fact that more people are borrowing money is not necessarily good or bad. That's not a judgment call. The question is, the point here is that more people are borrowing as much as they can, suggesting that more people, unless that's the exact amount they want to borrow, would like to borrow more than they can. Consistent with that is this sort of simultaneous thing that we've seen in the US, it started to happen in Canada, but not nearly to the extent, which is private lenders have gotten into this market, where they never were in this market. They used to lend to MBAs, doctors, and lawyers, law students. They used to lend to them. They've always lent to them. But starting in the early to mid-90s, they started lending to undergraduates, usually with a parent as a cosigner. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And that basically, it went from almost none of the market to about a quarter of the market by the mid-2000s. I'll show you a graph. So again, consistent with the government program not providing enough credit, the private lenders usually provide credit at a little bit worse terms than the government. So your best bet is to go to the government first, and that tends to be the case. But the private sector started to pick up some of that slack, so there's a question of whether they've provided enough credit for everybody, and we're fine. It's just before the government did it, and now the private sector does it, and everybody's fine. The problem with that is that I think there's a couple of interesting, even if you think they're providing enough credit, I don't think they are, given the fact that incomes become a lot more important in determining who goes. But even if they are, there's a lot of interesting questions about how the private sector decides to offer that credit, who they're giving it to, how they set the terms. And those are the kinds of some of the issues we want to kind of end with later today. And then kind of on top of it, so one look at the problem, if you talk to one group of people thinking about this issue, they're going to tell you all about, they're going to call this access. Oh, do students have access to college? That's the buzzword if you talk to people at student loan programs, et cetera. And there the whole question is, oh, do we provide enough credit to students? And then if you read the newspaper lately, the New York Times in particular seems to like to pull out a crazy example every couple of weeks about, do students have borrowed, students borrowed $100,000 in an art history major, and now they can't pay it back because they can't find a job. I don't know what world they thought they were going to find a job that would allow them to pay back $100,000 a year, but someone obviously thought they could, or they thought at least their parents were good for it, most likely. But there's this sort of flip side, which is the concern about people borrowing sort of too much. And that's sort of a very vague statement on purpose, because we want to talk about that at the end. But there's concerns that people are borrowing a lot of money, and what happens if the labor market's crappy and they can't find a job, like the last few years, or just they get unlucky and can't find a job. What kind of contracts are out there? And what kind of insurance is provided against those kind of outcomes in the current contracts? And more generally, what's the optimal way to set these contracts up, given this is potentially a big problem? I mean, another sort of set of evidence in the macro literature in particular has shown sort of that the uncertainty in earnings has gone up considerably over the last few decades. To be a little careful, at least the variances have gone up, and the sort of interpretation is the shocks, some persistent and some transitory shocks, have become more variable over recent years. Again, sort of making this kind of more important issue to worry about than maybe we used to have to worry about. That, coupled with costs being very high, has become important.
Are we considering also the possibility, because it seems that the big alternative is not like in the world, like what exists is not really like a different system of getting loans, but more like low cost and public provision through taxation, let's say. And it seems to me that like in England, where now they are kind of moving from a continental Euro system where there were low tuition and like paid through taxation to a more, not as extreme as in the US, but tending to debt with like loans, etc. There is really the debate between the two systems, at least in the press.
No, I mean, that's exactly what I start off saying. I think that's the big question. The big question is, what's the right way to structure the whole financing of human capital? That's, in some level, a much harder question, because now you've got to ask why the government's involved in the first place. One reason is potentially credit constraints. It's not clear why subsidies are the right way to deal with that problem. Then we want to sort of think about lending contracts and what kind of insurance we want to provide. But I think one of the justifications is the sort of issues of inequality more generally, preferences for sort of a somewhat more equal society, arguments about externalities, how big they are. I think the evidence on that is kind of all over the map, depending on who you ask. I think it's, in particular, that means the evidence is not that strong one way or the other. So I think there's all of those things come in on top of everything I'm going to talk about today that I think are important issues that, in order to think about the whole scope for how much government financing we want, you need to wrestle with that stuff as well. And I'm not equipped to do that right now, and I don't think anybody really is, which wouldn't prevent people from doing it. But I want to sort of take a somewhat more modest, but I think still a pretty big problem, which is given whatever our current levels of funding are, even given our current structure for financial aid, say, in terms of grants and need-based aid, how do we want to just set up contracts that lend money to people and we get our money back? What's the right way to do that? And right now, can people do that to the extent that they'd like? That's sort of what the heart of today is going to be about. But I think entirely another really important and bigger question is sort of, I actually think you'd want to think about all this together, not what's the subsidy level and then how do we set up these contracts. You'd want to sort of step back and say, what should our financial aid system look like, for example? If you look at these expected family contributions, I'll show you some of those. They're not based on any economics. I mean, they're monotonically increasing, and higher income families pay more, which wouldn't be hard to get out of an economic model. But where they come up with the slope and the structure that I can't, the language they use talks about poverty, this much related to the poverty level. Why that's the right concept to think about setting financial aid, I have no idea. But that starts to enter into a lot of interesting problems about family dynamics too. How much should parents be expected to pay for their kids? And different countries have come down differently on that. So I think that there's a whole host of really interesting problems there that are maybe somewhat independent with this, I think, but ultimately probably link with what I'm going to talk about today. So here's, this is kind of what I'm going to put. These slides will be available to you guys. So
Can I just ask one question?
Yeah.
I was just wondering, is there any change? I mean, what changes have there been in composition of students over those 10 years? And is there any evidence of sort of lowering aversion to debt?
Yeah, I don't know what to think about this debt aversion concept. People like it. There's probably something to it. I don't know what role that plays. I'll tell you some numbers a little bit later that I think make you start thinking along that lines, although I think there's a different way to think about it as well. I forgot your first question.
The composition, is the composition of college students dramatically different?
What do you mean by composition?
I'm just wondering, is there a large proportion poor or a large proportion?
Oh, I'll show you some numbers on that.
Those loans are like public loans, right?
Well, the government, so this line up here is government loans. That's like the Stafford loan program. There's also the Perkins. I'll be a little clear about that, although I'll maybe go over that quickly and let you look at the slides for details. This stuff, when I talk, those include government directly lending money as well as the government backing the loans. So there's a whole set of loans that banks lend, but they don't do it anymore. They got rid of that the last year or two. But up until a year or two ago, banks used to provide a lot of the loans for students, and they would be backed up by the government, so insured by the government if there's a problem repaying. So I want to call that all government loans, because they're all regulated by the government, the rules they set. They get a little they get some leeway on interest rates, or not on interest rates, but on sort of on some sort of charges they can make. But for the most part, those are all kind of the same. And when I talk about whenever I talk about private student loans, I want to think about those as completely outside the government system. Just a bank or some guy sets up a loan program for students, and the only rules they have to follow are the standard rules in terms of bankruptcy. So they're like any bank lending in a credit card, but they set up separate programs for students. And they've changed the rules a little bit on how those are treated, but I'll talk about that.
But is their rate different?
Interest rates?
Yeah.
Yeah, they tend to be a little bit higher on these private loans,
Yeah.
but they're free to set whatever they want. Now, the government does subsidize it, so implicit in these, the rates that the government's setting is a subsidy, and there's a subsidized loan that also provides some subsidy, which I'll be a little explicit on. I think the subsidy component's not that big of a deal. It's there. Oh, whether the subsidy component, I don't think that's a dramatic change over the years. I mean, there's a question of, oh, why doesn't everybody borrow the maximum and then invest the money somewhere else? If you're a student, if you have any assets, the government takes it all away in terms of aid that you might have. And I just don't think, my bet would be the money is not there to make that worth all the hassle that would involve. You're talking maybe a couple $100 you'd make out of something like that, and a whole lot of hassles with financial aid offices, et cetera. So I don't think that's what's going on, although I suppose one might try to argue that. So here's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. I'll give you an overview of college costs and financial aid in the US, and there'll be a couple of graphs on Canada because I have it conveniently available. So I'm going to give you an overview of what the system looks like. I've already kind of set it up a little bit. And I'm going to talk about it's just a simple two-period model for thinking about the role of borrowing constraints. So then we could talk about some of these issues that we kind of hit on already in an explicit model. And then I'm going to sort of say how that provide, the kind of empirical predictions that have come out of that people have looked at in a lot of different papers and different surveys. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about sort of the role of credit constraints, and just more generally about sort of who's going to college and who's not, and how that relates to family income or other factors. Then I'm going to spend a little time potentially, although if I'm running way behind, I might not spend much time on it, but talk a little bit about human capital investments at younger ages in children and then at older ages, and then the role of borrowing constraints at different times in the life cycle. And it's sort of broaden the concept of borrowing constraints and think more about sort of life cycle human capital investment and not just it's a factor at college ages. And there's good reason to think constraints are maybe much more distortionary at younger ages and families investing in young children than there is at college-going ages, given all the setup we have in terms of financial aid for college. But we'll talk a little bit about that. How much would depend on sort of how I'm doing on time. And then the last sort of last third of kind of what I want to talk about is to actually think about where these constraints come from. And sort of within this very simple two-period model that I set up at the beginning, now let's layer on kind of different instead of saying these constraints come from nowhere, let's think about where they come from. Let's think about what the way government constraints actually look, the way government student loan programs actually look, the way private lending constraints might look if there's commitment problems in terms of if people can sort of walk away from their obligations. And then I want to think about, that's going to start off with all sort of a world with full certainty. And that sort of provides some useful insights, but I think in order to start thinking about interesting policy questions and the right way to design a student loan system or private credit contracts, et cetera, you need to sort of grapple with the issues of uncertainty that individuals face and private information problems as well as potentially commitment problems. So that's kind of going to be where I'm going to sort of end the discussion is sort of, and that's extremely new stuff. There's not even a paper on it. I mean, there are papers sort of hitting at this out there in the literature. What I'm going to talk about is just a very simple framework that just ties nicely with what we did earlier. And that's, this is where I'm pushing my set of knowledge. But and then I'll sort of come back at the end and just spend a few minutes talking about, I think, some of the big questions that are out there. So if you guys are looking for topics to work on, I don't know what stage everybody's at. Maybe you already have a paper done. But there's always new papers to be written. Some things I think would be interesting to think about, although they're going to be very vague. So I'll let you fill in the blanks. All right, so that's my motivation. I'm going to just kind of quickly go through just sort of what the environment in the US looks like. Some of you may not be familiar with it entirely. So here's sort of a different picture of tuition levels. These are sort of using a CPI to deflate them just from the College Board. And you see sort of the blue line is what everybody talks about in the newspaper. That's private four-year tuition levels just sort of skyrocketed over the period that I'm talking about over the last 30 years. They've gone up fivefold. But even if you look at sort of public four-year tuition, that's gone up incredibly, also at a very fast rate. It's just at a lower level. And you also see it holding for public two-year tuition as well. It's about $3,000. Most states, it's around state level. There's a lot of variation, actually. If you look at public four-year tuition, it ranges from around $3,000 to $4,000 to $15,000 typically. That's for in-state tuition. If you want to go some other state, you're typically going to be talking closer to the blue line in a lot of these states. There's a lot of aid out there, so let's get the structure. I'm not going to go into detail on all this stuff, but there's sort of merit aid and scholarships. The federal government's gotten involved in, well, not so much. It's more state governments. This Hope Scholarship in Georgia and a bunch of states kind of followed suit on that, where they require sort of certain grades in high school to get the aid. It's not that hard of a line to meet. But institutional aid is more and more playing a role in terms of, every institution now. There's some interesting books by McPherson and Shapiro, if you're interested in this, just talking about how it is that, and if you talk to anybody who's got a kid going to college, almost every institution, the price people pay is different from the posted tuition price. And it's not just rich kids, it's not just poor kids that pay different prices, it's rich kids as well, because every school is trying to attract sort of the best student they can get. So they're all, Chris Tabor, a friend and colleague of mine, also sort of had his daughter applying to a couple of different colleges, and the range in quality was not that great, but the range in price went from full tuition at one to zero tuition at the other for things that moved in the rankings about 20 points in the liberal arts rankings. So there's a huge amount of pricing taking place, and aid it's largely related to ability, but on top of that, you have sort of the need-based aid, and so there's not a lot of literature on that, and I think it's a really interesting question for people to think about. There's some recent stuff on this. Holger Sieg and some others, Chao Fu as well has been thinking about this, and a few others. There's some. That's true. That's true. Hector Chade, I don't know, is he? And Lona Smith, I guess, and Lona Smith at Wisconsin as well. We'll be talking later, I guess. They've thought about this as well, more from a theoretical point of view. There's tax-based aid. I'll give them 1 second here. Need-based grants and institutional aid. I'm going to kind of go through these bottom two things in a bit of detail, and then student loans is sort of, that's kind of the environment you're facing on top of whatever the price is. Yep.
Do you have a concrete idea of exactly what the incentives are for universities to get the best students in? I mean, I can imagine how they're the best students, but I'm just wondering.
Yeah, it's a real question of what someone who's not making any profits off of something, what's their objective function? I don't have any idea. I mean, it's obvious why a profitable, for-profit institutions might care about that, although they seem to play in the low-quality market for the most part, trying to extract as much money out of those guys as they can. I don't know. I can't begin to say what their objective. They seem to care a lot about rankings for whatever reason. I guess presidents get cheered if they get a good ranking and run out of town if they get a bad one. But why? I'm not. I think usually when the theoretical models tend to put something on that they value quality, but why or how that comes about, I don't know.
Don't alumni donations play a big role?
Alumni donations do. I mean, but there's still the question is, what do they don't make any profits. So what are they after? I mean, maybe they get their own paycheck higher, and it's purely, although that's got to be very weakly linked to any of this stuff. But I don't know. Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just competition or for whatever reason. Yeah, I don't know. I think, obviously how you write down that objective function is going to affect how so potentially one could back out the objective function. I guess that's in part empirically what you might want to do is, given some game and problem, what's the objective function of these institutions given what I see their behavior? So one could try to go about it that way. You'd have to sort of stipulate something that you think they care about, but.
I actually do concur with my view is that that's actually a very underappreciated
economists have done a poor job of modeling college preferences, as it were, and so the papers in the literature either for some strange form of profit maximization, or the payoff is simply to have the highest average student quality in the overlay.
Right. I agree. I don't think the literature's gotten into this very deeply in any way. I mean, this bidding for students kind of idea is not, that's a fairly recent thing among universities. I think if you went back 10 to 20 years ago, it was not very common. I think it's just could become much more common now, in part with the costs going up so much potentially. But again, I don't think that's been, this whole area I think is really understudied, and there's probably a lot of interesting things to do. And it's a literature I don't know that well either. Yep.
Are you going to tell us a bit about the effective cost of going to school in the sense that they are more like institutional AP grants, and certainly that schools that have the resources to do it?
I'll talk a little bit about it. I won't talk too much across. I'm going to talk about it more at public schools and averages. I'm not going to talk much about how endowments relate to prices and this kind of stuff. I don't know if there's much research on all that. There probably is some, but I don't know it that well. I'm going to try and focus on, I want to focus more on the need-based aid part of things, because I'm more interested in what role, what's the extent to which low-income kids can't go to school, or have or low middle-income kids have a hard time going, more than than differences by ability per se, although that's going to play a role. So I don't go through this. So you guys asked lots of questions, so let me get to some more interesting stuff. But in the slides, and if you're interested, and this is very weak, there's sort of a little bit of an overview of kind of the big programs if you want to think about taxes. I'll show you kind of the amounts. You're talking about $1,000 to $2,000 potentially available to you for tax breaks if you're sending a kid to school or if you're a kid in school. More related is sort of the need-based aid and grants. You have the Pell Grants are the major U.S. grant. If you want to know who's getting those, about 3/4 of all the students have family income less than $30,000. So this is really going to the low end of the income distribution. It's a big program, about 9 million people, $35 billion. And they can get about $5,500 a year. So that can help cover not only tuition, but also living expenses. On top of that, there's this much smaller program that's not as much well talked about, and it covers a lot less students, the Supplemental Educational Opportunity Grant. That also focuses on low-income students. Not, about 60% goes to families less than $30,000. So again, that's targeted, and that generally just is something that goes on top of Pell Grants as well. Now I'll kind of show you how all these things add up in a few minutes for a typical student from different income backgrounds. But I just kind of give you an overview of the main sort of parts of the system so you could think about it. And when you talk about federal loans, government loans, whenever I talk about government loans, these are the kinds of things I'm talking about. There's the Perkins Loans program, which is targeted to very low-income students. Again, about 60% go to family income less than $60,000. Not nearly as targeted as the Pell Grants, but it really doesn't serve that many people. And the way it's set up, it's not. People just don't. They can qualify for $4,000 or $5,000. I'll show you in a second. But most students don't get very much from this program. It almost doesn't even show up in the numbers in terms of how much students are getting when you look at averages. So it's only 500,000 recipients. The big program in terms of loans that dominates and that most of the literature would talk about would be the Stafford Loan Program. That's almost 9 million students, undergraduates. And there's both a subsidized and an unsubsidized component. So in order to get the subsidized component, essentially means you don't have to pay interest while you're in school. And the last year or two, you also get a lower interest rate when you're done. There's a component that you can get that's need-based, and then the unsubsidized amount everybody can qualify for. And that turns out to be a big program and a lot of money. So I'll show you some numbers on that specifically. And that's available to graduate students as well. The loan limits for graduate students are quite high. If anyone is an American and needs money, that's a good source. You guys should be smoothing. And then there's the PLUS program. It used to just be one. The name is sort of parental loans, something or other. Now they sort of broke it up into two parts where graduate students themselves can take these out instead of their parents. And again, that's kind of small potatoes relative to the Stafford loan program. But that basically allows parents to borrow for their kid. So the parents are the ones that are signing the document and are responsible for repaying. This gives you a little bit of a sense for kind of some of the key issues. What I want to focus on is the loan limits. If you just look at sort of the lifetime limits, undergraduate, the Perkins loan, don't worry about that. That just doesn't play much of a role. But the Stafford loan, you can get up to $23,000 over your undergraduate career for that, and $31,000 total in terms of unsubsidized. So if you're a poor student, you can borrow up to $23,000 potentially that's subsidized, and then the balance, another $8,000 that would be unsubsidized. If you're sort of a high-income, middle-income family that doesn't qualify for aid, then you're sort of in this unsubsidized category. You can see the interest rates differ there. This is sort of what the whole fight for the subsidized Stafford. This was the whole fight in Congress over whether we should keep student loan interest rates down. It was over this 3.4 versus 6.8% for the subsidized Stafford. And you can see the graduate lifetime student loan limits for graduate students are quite high. You can borrow basically another $100,000 for graduate school if you want to. And the way these work is, well, I'll get into this, but there's a deferment period. You don't have to pay them back while you're in school. You basically, when you're done with school, either you leave, you quit, flunk out, or you graduate. After either 6 or 9 months, then you're supposed to start repaying your loan. Sort of what's the repayment side? The whole, most of this literature on access never talks about the other side, which is that you're supposed to pay these things back, and what if you don't? I think that's an important side that I want to talk a little bit about. There's sort of a bunch of repayment plans. Some of these are fairly new. When I went to school, you basically had the standard repayment plan and something like this extended repayment plan, which is just fixed payments for 10 years. The extended repayment, if your debt's high enough, you can go up to a 30-year term even. But that's just sort of a standard repayment. Here you pay back X amount of dollars every year until your balance is due, and they stretch that out over 10 or 20 or however many years you want. And you can sort of move between these. That's fine. The new stuff over the last decade, although I think they keep fiddling with this stuff, so it's hard to actually keep track of what the current rules are, but I think these are the current ones. There's a nice website, finaid.com. Some guy, I don't know who, all kinds of lots of details. If you're interested in anything, it's a good starting point for looking at this kind of stuff. There's an income-based repayment, which is basically you can pay back 15% of sort of some discretionary income. That's sort of your income above some amount, where here's how they define it. It's your adjusted gross income, figure your tax forms, less 1.5 times the poverty line. So if you're a low-income guy, this is one way to lower your payments. If you borrowed a lot and you sort of have very low income after school, you can sort of move to income-based repayment. And then if anything you haven't paid back after 25 years, you're off the hook on. That's a long time. Australia has something like this. I think it's 15%, but it's after only 10 years, I think, you're off the hook. And it varies across. Canada has something similar to this program here. Then there's some other thing, the income contingent repayment. It's almost impossible to figure out exactly what you're paying back. But it's 20% of your discretionary income or some amount that's, I cannot find anywhere that tells you what this income percentage factor is, so I don't know how to, it varies between 0.5 and 1, I think. So that tells you a little bit. Basically, if you have a, so you could think about these sort of different types of programs. Basically, these are designed if you have sort of a lot of debt relative to your income, you can move into sort of one of these types of programs as well. And you can move between these once a year, I think. Yep?
So which poverty line?
Whatever the government poverty line is. What do you mean?
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering, Is that like a poverty line established as is that a relative poverty line or?
No, I think it's sort of you got 4 kids and this is what you live in this area, this is your poverty line. See, these are the official poverty lines that the government's putting out, that they would use to base all kinds of government programs on.
Is this a family income or individual income? So if there's a woman that was married.
Yeah, it's a bit tricky. I think this is.
What is the question?
This is how does this apply to family? You know, if you're married, how do these things?
So basically, the way they do this is depending on how you file your taxes. So if you're filing jointly, then they take your income together. If you're filing separately, then they take your income.
Liability in the end.
Well, this is what your payment. I guess your payments, if you want to go into this system, would be based on depending on.
Yeah. I mean, it's a big crapshoot either way. And the way, having been on deferment for economic hardship, if you're not making any money, there's nothing for them to take. But, you know, oh, yes, you can be liable for these other loans. So it's things here are kind of complicated.
I think it's a bit of. I mean, this is where it's a bit gray, and you can't. It's not very easy to find. I mean, you maybe know more about this.
I used to do college counseling.
Oh, okay. So yeah. So I mean, if someone racks. I mean, I was wondering the answer to this. If someone racks up a lot of debt, and they decide they're not going to work the rest. They marry some rich guy or gal, and they decide they're not going to pay off their loans. I suspect if they have joint assets, the government could go after those joint assets. I don't know if they don't, you know, if they never bother to save anything, and all the income's coming from the husband, say, and the wife's not working, but she has all this debt. I don't know whether they have a right to go after that or not. Do you know?
I mean, a lot of it depends on how you're filing and stuff. So basically, in this country, when you marry. And some of it depends on states. When you marry, you link up not only your assets, but also your debts. So it's kind of like having a roommate. If your roommate skips out on the rent, you're still responsible for it. So if your spouse is not paying their bills, you're still responsible because y'all are married. And the same thing happens with student loans.
Yeah, so my impression on these things is just a lot of discretion. It's actually, I'll tell you a little bit about what happens when you default. And there are rules, and then there's sort of what actually gets implemented, and it's not very easy to, sort of what actually happens is not so obvious. I think it's changed over time. But in principle, yeah, this stuff's easy to think about in one-person family, you know, one adult families. It's a little bit trickier with 2 adult families. And I think given that these are linked to poverty lines, et cetera, that it is going to be family-related income. And again, this wipes out any debt after 25 years if you have anything left. So if you never earn any money, they're not going to take anything. There are also sort of other types of things like forbearances and deferments, which you can get as well, that sort of let you off the hook for making any payments for periods of time. In some cases, in deferments, the interest accumulates. In a forbearance, it doesn't. And again, that's sort of going to be related to what's your family income relative to probably something very similar to this poverty line measure. So then what happens if you decide you don't want to pay it back? I mean, that's a choice that you might want to make. We're going to think about it later as a choice and how that drives things. So again, you have a 6 to 9 months after you leave school before you're even required to start paying back. And then it takes another 9 months before you would, of non-payment. At any point in time, after 9 months of non-payment, then you're generally officially considered in default. So, you know, for anybody to actually show up as a defaulter would be well over a year before they would actually have the potential to even show up. Most cases, default occurs very quickly within the first year, although not always. What happens? Well, they can impose collection costs on you, and you get some sort of harassing phone calls, you know, supposedly within the rules of the law. But those costs immediately add about 20 to 40% onto what you owe. There's a wage garnishments. They can garnish up to 15% of your sort of disposable pay. So basically, they can't leave you with less than sort of the minimum wage income. So if you're earning less than the minimum wage, you're fine. If you own your own business, they can't do the wage garnishment. So that's sort of, you know, a lot of doctors, lawyers, et cetera, wouldn't fall in that category. Wouldn't have to worry about it. They can take, you know, if you have an income tax return, you're supposed to get some money back. They can take that if you file it in a way such that you have a return. The big thing, most likely, one of the big problems is they report it to credit agencies. So immediately you're going to have a bad mark on your credit report. And it's going to last until you start paying it back. And that has all kinds of sort of indirect effects. You know, nowadays, a lot of companies are looking at credit reports to think about whether they're going to hire somebody. If you want an apartment, you may have to sort of show a credit report or something like that. So this kind of starts to show up in all kinds of ways that it's tricky to think about. And you know, you can't get any additional federal aid. So if you decide you want to go back to school, you have to get yourself back into good standing. Start paying your loans back again for a certain period of time. And the one big thing about, it used to be only true of government student loans, but in 2005 they changed the rule on this. You can't discharge these through bankruptcy, or at least it's very, very hard to do it. So it's not like you can rack up 100 grand in debt and then go through bankruptcy and wipe it all clean. Well, they have to get that loan from somebody else. I don't know. Well, sometimes you could keep borrowing in extra years potentially. But here, I don't think it would make sense to borrow from a private lender to pay off your government loans because you're probably going to be borrowing at a higher rate, and the private lenders are going to be a lot less amenable to giving you deferments or any sort of hardship kind of breaks. And the other side of it is if you owe a lot of money and you're having a hard time paying it off, not many private lenders are going to want to bet on you. You might be able to buy a home or something like that because you have an asset or a car. You might have more luck getting something like that. But it's going to be harder to get sort of unsecured credit.
I guess if you're on this, oh, sorry.
No, maybe not to.
Well, you might in a short run buying or something. Maybe if you have a credit card, you could sort of rack up some credit card debt and pay. If your income's particularly low, you're almost always going to be better off going to the government and telling them, I've got really low income right now. I can't pay it, and they can give you a deferment. Or now it's not like that always happens instantaneously. So there's some. It's maybe not as easy as it sounds. So it may, if you know 1 month or 2 months you've got a bad situation, potentially if you have a credit card, you might be able to do something like that. I think for sort of longer periods of time, a year or something like that, that's not likely to be very successful.
I was going to ask, are there prepayment penalties if you're on this 10-year?
Usually not. Usually you can pay these off as fast as you want. If I say something wrong, let me know. So far, I'm doing all right?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that if you're in public service and on the income-based repayment plan, and you prove that and make 120 payments while you're in the right job, they will waive the rest of it.
Yeah, there's some for like teachers. Is it teachers or?
If you work for a nonprofit, if you work for most government agencies, some universities. So yeah, if you work at a public university,
you might be able to get really.
It won't pay you enough. But you make 120 payments while you're employed at the right job, and after those 120 payments, you're slated.
They forgive the rest.
That started with the new healthcare law and all that stuff.
Okay. Yeah, like I say, they keep fiddling with things. Those kind of things kind of change quite frequently. Who they're going to give a break to. They used to do one for teachers.
They used to do that one still exists.
That one still exists.
Teachers still exist, but it's just sort of been expanded. But graduate students no longer get subsidized student loans as of last week.
Oh, is that right? I haven't been
No more
watching
grace period, right?
No more grace period for anybody.
For the
As
graduate?
of last week. For graduates or undergraduates.
No grace period?
Yeah. So you have to start paying right after.
Right when you graduate?
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see that. Okay, that's useful.
It was a big deal for all of like 10 minutes, and then they snuck it in last.
I see. I see. Oh, so that was part of the whole deal to keep the interest rates down?
To keep the interest rates down and to keep the Pell Grant.
So they're gonna make everybody pay right away. Oh, okay. That's I'll have to go look at that. I did prepare some of this ahead of time. What about private loans? So these guys are in some sense unrestricted. So how do they decide to do it? I don't think they do it very well, to be honest. In part because it's a new market that they haven't been very involved in. But they, in principle, can make the terms, the amounts they're going to lend you. Everything can depend on what school you might go to, what year you're in, what major, your degree, your credit score. They often are going to ask for a cosigner, or at least the cosigner is going to give you much better terms. Your credit score, although that's pretty meaningless for an 18-year-old. In many ways, all the things that we're going to talk a little bit about private lenders and what they should be doing. And it's all kinds of it's things that the banks aren't used to thinking about very much. They're used to thinking about people that have been 30s, 40s, wanting to buy a home. They have a whole credit history. They have a lot of knowledge about how to think about that and who's going to pay it back and who's not. There's a bigger question: do they have any idea? Do any of their finance guys that solve these things know anything about labor economics and who's going to earn what later on? In talking to some of these guys at these banks, I don't think they know very much, although some smaller lenders have tried to get in and exploit this, and I expect this to change as this market grows. But as of 2005, the bankruptcy ruling, a loan that's considered a student loan from a private bank, I don't know exactly what you need to do to do that, although I expect there's got to be proof that you're using it to pay for school, is no longer dischargeable through bankruptcy. So it used to be, and now it's not. So again, it has that similar kind of, it stays on your record and it's not easy to get rid of. You can't rack up 100 grand and then just default on it. So that's an interesting change, and it kind of came in right before the crash, so it's a little bit hard to think about what that would have done. But I think it's an interesting thing to think about what role that's played. If they want, they can garnish your income in principle, but if they want to do that, they have to take you to court. So it's a little more costly for them to do it. It's a little harder. They can offer lower repayments as you go, or longer repayment plans. So that may be a reason to look into these, even if you qualified for the public loans or could get more government loans. That may be one reason you'd want to look at it. But I think that tends not to be that true, not that useful in general. Credit cards, obviously, sort of standard unsecured credit. In a sort of a traditional way, a lot of families have dealt with it, like a lot of homeowners, is sort of taking out a second mortgage on your home or other types of home equity loans or these HELOC loans, where you basically borrow against your house, borrow more against your house to help finance it. It varies depending on what you look at. This is, you have to be really careful when you look at some of these numbers of whether you're looking at full-time students, part-time students, dependents, not dependents. This is kind of everyone. I think more interesting is sort of what's the amount of loan dollars, and this sort of shows you the total amounts being borrowed in constant dollars just over the last 10 years. And you see it's basically doubled over this period. It's just a dramatic increase. And if you were to go back to the 80s, it would keep going down. And the top light blue line it's not entirely, but it's effectively private student loans. So you see that market, even in 01, is pretty small. Is pretty small. It basically doubled in about a 7-year period. Doubled its importance. There's been a sort of huge growth in private lending. What happened in 08 was the government expanded Stafford loan limits by a non-trivial amount, by a few $1,000s a year, and so you see the Stafford loans going up and basically eating almost entirely out of the private student loans. So it's still a big role, but it's smaller than it was, and that's sort of entirely due to the government loans expansion.
I have a question about that. Did you find, or do you think that it was the relatively non-trivial amount, or was it the education around the program in general, because the amount was expanding, that more people started taking Stafford loans?
I haven't looked at this to see what's going on. I doubt there's been a big jump in enrollment coincidental with this. I mean, it's anything trying to. They did all these changes, but everything's so messed up with all kinds of major economic changes outside the education sector. It's really hard to sort of pinpoint what might be driving what. I think the bankruptcy stuff, ruling changed in 2005. I mean, one of the things you saw when the credit crunch happened in 2008, I guess, is a lot of these private lenders just shut down. Before a lot of them went out of business, shut down. Banks just wanted to get rid of anything that looked risky right away. So you went from like 300-400 of these different programs that you could borrow from to like 50. And almost anyone going to community college no longer could have any chance. Basically, they stuck around at the 4-year public schools. Some of the better schools they would still lend to students at, but everyone else just got shut out of that market. And then right around that same time, you have the government stuff. I mean, all this stuff interacts. The government responds a little bit to this as well, and also increased how much students can borrow. How much that they would have done anyway is a different question. I don't know when they started talking about that.
Are they for-profit ones there too?
Yeah, so they would be in these numbers, and I'll show you in a second default rates a little bit by those guys. For-profits are a small part of the total dollar amounts, although these students do borrow a lot. So they borrow more than, say, the public school students at public schools, and even the nonprofits. They tend to borrow a lot, and they tend to not repay it at pretty high rates. But in terms of total loan volume in dollars, it's pretty small. Yeah, I mean, these guys are just they're sort of I won't say a drop in the bucket, but they're like 10 to 15% of the market, roughly.
It's not per capita, right? This is billions, this is picture.
Yeah, this is in.
If you have increased
Yeah.
the number of students, and then you're like.
Yeah, I mean, there's a small increase in the number of students over time, but this is. I mean, if you looked at per capita numbers, they're going to look exactly like this almost. The number of students is not rising that much. That's not rising that much either. Let me skip this. How much are people borrowing? So the New York Times always likes to talk about those that borrowed $100,000. Among those with a bachelor's degree, about 10% are borrowing $40,000 or more. So these guys with this $80,000, those guys are really the exception. They're not very common. But there is, there's a 10% with a sizable amount of undergraduate debt, 20% with more than $30,000. It's a lot less those getting an associate's degree, although it's not trivial. But this kind of gives you a sense for sort of how much, what's the distribution of loan amounts, depending on what you come out with at the end when you get your degree. The repayment side, how much, what do repayment cohort default rates look like? They were really high in the early 1990s. It was almost all attributed to for-profit institutions, although it was also some associate degree programs, 2-year schools. Plummeted in the 90s. They implemented some rules. The economy was good. It's not clear exactly what drove it, what was the main factor. We're kind of looking into that. But this is kind of what people have been talking about the last few years, is that default rates have actually started going up over the last few years, almost doubling over the last, say, 5 years. But default rates really, they're not that high for, for unsecured credit. It's not really awful anyway. Here's where that masks a lot of variation. If you look at sort of public institutions, and then the dark one is sort of less than 4-year schools, but not these sort of 1-year programs, 2-3-year programs, and then 4-year programs. You see, whether you look at public or private, not-for-profit, things look pretty similar. Default rates are higher for students going to sort of community-type colleges or getting associate's degrees, around 10, 12%, and much lower for people getting a bachelor's degree. This is just a tenet, so you're not necessarily getting the degree, but people going to 4-year schools, default rates are closer to around 4%, about half of that, and not that different. And then you've got out here these for-profit schools. And this is where all the problems are, really. And this is why the government's sort of wringing their hands, trying to figure out what to do to these guys. You know, it's upwards of around 15%, whether you look at the 2-3-year or the 4-year programs. So this is where, I mean, if you really want to crack down, this is where a lot of the action is. Part of the problem is these are groups that are, these are schools that are often serving pretty low-income groups. And, you know, kind of the argument they would like to make is we're sort of giving these guys a chance. Sort of the flip side is you're not really giving them much of a chance. You just say you are, and that's a whole debate to be had there.
Is there a big difference between folks who finish and who don't? Because I think one of the things with the proprietary institutions, a lot of people don't. A lot of them don't finish. Yeah, default rates are quite a bit, and I don't know how much that would explain of this. It's an interesting question, but default rates tend to be quite a bit higher if you don't finish your degree than if you do. I don't remember the numbers on that. We've looked at that and some point. I mean, it's a pretty. I mean, that's a pretty big factor, though. But I can't tell you the number. Yep. Their completion rates are a lot lower. So that might explain a big part of this. I don't know how much that would explain. Oh, okay. Yeah, I should. Oh, what is this number? So this is 2 years out. Oh, let me see. I think. So this is 2 years after you finish school. Is this, I can't remember. This is if you've ever defaulted over that period or if you're currently in default 2 years after. Does anybody know? These are sort of the official cohort default rates they refer to them as. I don't remember. I should know that, but I don't. About half of people that go into default will come out after a few years. My guess is that given that they're looking at 2 years, those numbers wouldn't be that different.
It's at least 9 months behind payments.
Yeah, so you have to be 9 months. Yeah, so in order to be considered in default, as I said, you have to not made a payment for 9 months. But I don't know whether you're still in these statistics if you've come back, if you've started making repayments within the time period or not. I should know that. I don't remember though. Yeah.
I don't know that.
You have a question? No?
I said I don't know that.
Okay. Now, this guy behind you has a question.
Sorry, can you just clarify again what proprietary institutions are?
For profit.
As opposed to the private institution?
Private, not for profit. So this is University of Chicago.
Yeah. No problem.
But
This is Phoenix. Phoenix. I had another graph, but it somehow didn't load well, and I was worried it was going to screw everything up. But looking at the different types of institutions over time and their patterns, and if you look at public you look at 4-year schools, there's a slight decline over this period, but not very dramatic. If you look at 2-year schools, they started around 20% in fall to around 10%, or roughly 10%. And then if you look at the for-profit schools, they start up around 40% default rates, falling to roughly these numbers over here. So a lot of the change is sort of for the for-profit, and then also somewhat for the private or for the 2-year schools. Not much action in 4-year public or private over this long time period. That's a lot flatter. Yep.
So why are we worried about the for-profit institutions not getting their money back? I mean, is it because
this is not their money? This is the government. These are all government programs. So the government's. I mean, there's a real question of whether they should sort of start requiring institutions to take put some skin in the game in some sense. Instead, what they do is they basically crack down on institutions that have high default rates. They don't allow their students to qualify for the federal student loan programs after a couple of years. There's precise rules on it. But that's why we might care about it. Yeah, otherwise, yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so this is all government defaults on government student loan programs. We don't really have numbers on the private student loans. I don't know of any. There's a little bit of stuff by the New York Fed now. They've got credit reports on everyone in the U.S. And they're looking a little bit at student loans and delinquency and payments. I think they can separate out private and public, private and government loans, but I don't know that but I don't think they've done it yet. But they sort of argue delinquency rates are quite a bit higher than these default rates. So it's often the case that people are delinquent.
So the problem is there's lots of private universities getting government loans for their degrees, and their students are flunking at
Exactly. So there's exactly.
Sorry.
That's the big concern. A lot of these guys are living off of government Pell Grants and loans. So who gets what? How is sort of the government aid determined? What's your sort of need? Well, first thing they figure out, we want to figure out what you think of this as your need. That's your need. This is your need here. They figure out what's the total cost to add up to tuition and living expenses. Living expenses are around $6,000. I'm going to give you some numbers for 2003 and 4 from a paper I have. And then they sort of calculate some expected family contribution. This is where I said, it's not clear where the hell they come up with this, but they have a formula that tells you if your family income is such and such and your assets are such and such, this is what we expect you to pay towards your kid. And it's increasing in parental assets and income. That's what you would expect. How much is a little bit different. I'll show you exactly what these things look like for a family with 2 kids. And there's also, in some cases, students are expected to contribute. Basically, if their income is above some exemption level, a few $1,000s, they're expected to kick in half of that. They're expected to kick in a lot of their assets as well, but that's usually not much of an issue. So what's your need? It's basically whatever the cost is less what they expect your family can contribute. And then your aid is going to generally be less than that if you run up against any upper limits on stuff. So this, both the government distribution of Pell Grants follows a formula and private institutions follow formulas that roughly look like this, although private institutions often use the federal ones, but sometimes they don't. I'll show you what they look like on average. I'll show you some stuff for Canada and the US. Give you a sense for what do aid schedules, net tuition, and expenditures look like for different family income backgrounds. So I'm going to just kind of average over 4 years, because some of these things you get money in 1 year and not in another. I'll show you sort of averages over a 4-year career, sort of, for post-secondary students. I'm going to show you numbers for students that aren't living with their parents. Some of the US numbers I'll show you are based on the NPSAS, so this is students that actually chose to enroll, so you may have a little selection going on there, although I don't think it's that big of a deal. Sort of traditional students attending 4-year public institutions, and that's about 80% of all US students are at 4-year schools, public schools. And for Canada, we don't have anything data like that. I'll just show you numbers for what the rules look like for families. It's kind of interesting how different they are, and not the way you'd expect. All right, we're kind of interested in 2 things. What's the price that people end up paying? That's going to be important for thinking about, are people constrained or not, or what are actual costs look like, and then, and that's actually just important for price effects. Thinking about demand curves. The other thing that we may be interested in is much more tightly related to just liquidity, which is what's your net tuition less any government loans that you can get. So here I'm going to take what loans can you qualify for, not what do you necessarily take out, but what can you actually get. And we want to think about that. This is the amount of money a family has to come up with, either out of their flows and their income, out of their assets, or going to some private lenders. So this is sort of a reasonable measure of liquidity, I think, and get a sense for sort of what's you can sort of think about whether families can afford to come up with this or not. Tuition. In the US, in 03-04, the median tuition level for a public school is about $4,000. See, there's some variation. The top half of the distribution is paying a couple thousand more, the bottom half a little bit less. Canada, actually, when you look at the numbers, actually it's not that out of line with the US. Most people think Canada is really cheap. It's cheaper now relative to the US than it was 10 years ago. But it's not that different, actually. It's a little bit higher because when you adjust for PPP, you'd have to inflate these by about 20%. But it's pretty similar to, say, Ontario, British Columbia. Quebec is very cheap, at least on the sticker price. Here's sort of what expected family contributions look like. This is sort of for the US when we look across different types of family income background. If your income's less than $15,000, you don't have to pay anything, or your expected contribution is 0. It rises pretty rapidly. Interestingly, in most of the Canadian provinces, up until sort of the median family income level, families aren't expected to kick in very much. Although they have all students are expected to contribute a few $1,000s. Unlike the US, they expect students to contribute, work in the summer and contribute. The US actually doesn't, surprisingly. Yep.
Beyond Ontario and British Columbia, is there a lot of variation across Canada?
Most of them will look a lot like British Columbia and Ontario. Quebec is kind of the real outlier. They have a completely different system, and they're outside the main Canadian system. So the other provinces will vary a little bit where this sort of starts to go up and what's the level of this, but not that much, really. Yep?
And do you have more low-income students going to college in the US than in Canada, given?
I'll show you that. Well, I won't show you that. Our paper talks about that. No, the US, the curious thing is that the US actually, family income is much more related to college going than it is in Canada. Despite what I'll show you, the US system is much more skewed towards providing aid to low-income students than is Canada. So, I mean, it suggests sort of for whatever reasons, the demand for education is much more related to, much more income elastic in the US than it is in Canada. I don't think it's driven by credit constraints entirely, but it's not obvious what it is. We spent a lot of time trying to figure out why. We thought it was going to be the financial aid system, because everybody thinks Canada's cheap. Canada's cheap in terms of tuition, but they're cheap in terms of what they give out in aid, too, it turns out. So if you look at grants and scholarships, at the low end, the US gives out a whole bunch of money relative to Canada. Canada's giving the same amount of money to anyone below the median, pretty much. And then you've got Quebec with some slope. The more interesting, the tax benefits, let me skip over that. So this is what sort of a total aid looks like, and total non-repayable aid, including tax credits, including grants and scholarships. The more interesting thing is, what's the net tuition? What did people pay at the end? So this is, think of this as the price schedules. The US, basically poor kids are getting paid a couple $1,000s to go to school. Now with that, they have to cover living expenses as well. But they're paid to go. And up until $40,000, even in low income and low and high tuition states, it's actually not that different at the bottom. All the difference is really at the top, where these guys aren't getting much aid anymore. So then the differences in tuition really matter. So a lot of the variation in tuition across states for low income families is undone by financial aid. Canada, again, is kind of, Ontario, you could see it's much less generous to low income families. Middle income, they're pretty similar, and then Canada is a little bit more generous for high middle income families. Quebec, surprisingly, everybody thinks is incredibly generous, looks a lot like the US in terms of effectively what the price you're paying is. It's probably the only dimension in which Quebec looks a lot like the US. Government student loans. This is almost all Stafford. The fact that this line doesn't slope downwards tells you that the Perkins loan program is kind of rounding error on how much available aid, how much aid people are actually getting, or how much loans people actually qualify for. And you see this Canadians basically give everybody a lot of loans until some threshold, and then they take it all away really quickly. So the US is pretty generous in terms of loans at the very high end. Everybody can borrow in the US somewhat. So what do families have to come up with? So if we sort of subtract off the loan amounts from the tuition amounts, you can see basically low-income people basically have $8,000 in resources to go to college at a public institution. They're getting $3,000 in free money, and they get another $5,000 in loans. So if you think you can live on $8,000, and that's then the view of the wrong view of credit constraints, I think, is that says, oh, these guys can't be borrowing constrained because they get $8,000. If you think, well, they're going to earn $30,000, $25,000, $30,000, $40,000, and they might want to borrow against that, Now that's not necessarily true. So they can finance it. It's not that they can't afford it in that sense, but they might not want to. So you see, again, the U.S. is very generous at the low end, but it's taking the aid away very quickly relative to Canada. It's much more sort of focused on the middle class. Basically, the middle class and the poor people are all kind of in the same boat in Canada. So that's what makes, and somewhat is puzzling, is if you look at income attendance gradients conditional on ability. I'll kind of show you a sense in the U.S. They're much steeper in the U.S. than they are in Canada. Canada looks a lot like the U.S. did in the early 80s for the NLSY 79. So I won't show you the numbers, but I could just tell you what they look like. So that's a completely different puzzle that I think is interesting, and what it is, that it tells you a lot more than just the structure of aid must be important in terms of who's going to college and who's not. There's a lot of other things going on, and it's not as simple as is there a borrowing constraint or not. Because here this would suggest if borrowing constraints are a problem, you'd expect more of that in Canada than the U.S. All right, so now, I don't know, that was kind of a very long setup for what the environment looks like. Yep.
This is a question. How much percent of the population are under $100,000 in U.S. and Canada?
Most. The average income for the top quartile, I can't remember these numbers off the top of my head. Steve, you work on measuring inequality. What fraction of the distribution of income is below 100,000 in the U.S. family income? You don't. I would guess it's around 75, 80%, and pretty similar in both countries. The difference, I mean, in Canada, there's almost nobody down here. That's really where the big difference is between Canada and the U.S. In Canada, there's almost nobody way down here. The bottom quartile is right around here in Canada. The bottom quartile in the U.S. is more like around here. So the bottom is a bit different. The top is actually not that different until you get way at the very high end.
So I mean, like, is the takeaway point from this graph that the people making under $80,000 in the U.S. and most of Canada, basically, like, the only cost that they're facing for going to college is the opportunity cost. What they could have done for college.
Well, this is not the cost. I mean, this is the cost, although it's not that high. But if you're in a high tuition state, it's a few $1,000 bucks. But you're right, the opportunity cost is a big cost. Mostly what I wanted to show today, I mean, I think there's all sorts of interesting things to think about here, but I wanted to give you a sense for what are people actually paying. I've showed you all those numbers on what tuition looks like, but those numbers in some sense are meaningless for most people. People are, some guys are getting paid to go, some guys are paying a little bit less than those numbers. I mean, the fact that they're going up over time, one thing it would be nice to do, and we're going to try to do, is maybe see how these things have changed over time. We know aid has somewhat offset the rise in costs, but I don't know what's the structure of this line. We can't go back, I think we can go back to the late 80s in the MPSAS and look at it. Whether the structure, whether this line would have been much lower back then or not, I don't quite know exactly what that looks like. That's an important question, though.
What do we know about people's information about this graph? Like, what extent do people know that going to college?
I don't know. I mean, there's a few people working on that question right now. I think there's some people that believe wholeheartedly that people know nothing about this. I don't know. I'm not sure that's true. There's some numbers that suggest you provide just the information. That's not that helpful. There's some stuff by Oreopoulos and a couple of co-authors looking at the H&R Block, some H&R Block data, where H&R Block ran an experiment and filled out aid forms for people. When they filled out aid forms for people, there was an impact on going to college. When they just told them roughly what price they would end up paying, there wasn't much impact, although they have very small samples for looking at that effect. So I think they're trying to look more. I think Phil Oreopoulos is doing some more work in Canada maybe on that. I think that's an area a lot of people are thinking about right now. I don't know what it's going to yield. I don't think we know yet what the answer is. Yep?
The U.S. high tuition is just for public or for public and private?
These are all public numbers.
So it's true that
social strength literature that a lot of the time to deal with this idea of output. People look at quasi-natural experiments on changes from policy to exogenous inflation. I mean, is there any sense in which that's been looked at in the education literature, like changes in policy and funding?
There's a little bit. There's some of that. I mean, a bit of that literature looks at, say, what happens if we... So here's a little bit what I could say a little bit to that, although there's been a number of studies. Susan Donarski's done some Tom Kane's done some, looked at what happens when they look at sort of a regression discontinuity kind of design. I think they do that. I can't remember exactly. Something with SSI program where they give benefits to survivors related to schooling. Tom Kane's done some stuff where there's sort of new programs that provide a bunch of aid to institutions, or aids to students. Like some new program in Washington comes in, or the Cal Grant program in California. There's been some study of the Hope Scholarship program by Donarski. I don't know if we cited in this paper with Alex Munghe, but I can give you some references on that if you want. There's a literature basically trying to look at what's the response to tuition. Right. And that tells you something about what the demand function looks like. Some people try to interpret something about credit constraints from that, but I'm not sure why. There's a little bit of a focus on whether the elasticity or responsiveness is greater for high or low income families. The argument, a lot of these models you can deliver sort of, if you're constrained, you're going to have a greater response. It's not that hard to get out of a model, although you can write models where that doesn't come out as well. Empirically, studies find different results on whether the elasticity is very different or the response is very different. So I think that's kind of not very well. I don't think we know that much about that. A lot of the studies look at variation in tuition across states. This should give you a little pause for that because the difference in average tuition between these two states is about $3,000, yet the tuition and the difference in price for low-income guys is a lot less, about a third or a quarter of that. It's only really relevant for the higher income guys. So one thing we're looking at is kind of trying to map these out, think about different states and map out the actual price paid versus tuition to think a little bit more about response to price. But there's a literature on that, but and the literature actually has a fairly broad consensus that the response to a $1,000 change in tuition is about 3 to 5 percentage points in terms of college attendance. Quite a few studies with a bunch of different things find stuff all in that range. There's a bit of a question whether $1,000 in aid is the same as lowering tuition by $1,000. Some of these studies argue it's not, although a lot of the recent studies have all looked at changes in financial aid programs, and those all find kind of numbers in the same ballpark.
I have a question. So how do you model whether it's what's the underlying framework?
Well, I'm going to start to get into a model right now. And it's not going to be so explicit about college. It's going to be human capital investment generally. And lots of papers take very different approaches.
So Lance, I know you're trying to run out, but is any effort being used to incorporate questions of beliefs with regard to college and survey work?
You mean in respect to costs? I don't know. I've been trying to get this on this new Canadian household panel survey, which I don't know if they're going to do in the end or not, but we wanted to put on some questions that are very specific. What would you have to pay? I don't see those questions out there. There are questions sort of, I think, much more general questions about what's tuition level or something, kind of vague. But this makes it really clear that you really want to know what do people know what they're going to pay or not. And I don't know that we know that answer. I mean, there's always a question of, do people know it, not know it until the point where they need to know it, and then do they go figure it out or not? Canada's, very strange in the sense that you fill out your financial aid after you've already applied to school and basically been accepted, and then you find out right before you enroll what your aid's going to be, which I find extremely strange. But the nice thing about Canada is everyone in Ontario's got the same structure. And now it's very easy. You go to some web. I mean, 10 years ago, I think this information might have been much more of a problem. Now it's there's a lot of websites you can go on and get a pretty good approximation of what your price is going to be paid at any particular institution. In Canada, all the provinces do it, provide something, calculators for it. So I think, until recently with the internet and sort of people making that more of an issue, I think it probably was more relevant 10 to 15 years ago when you couldn't find it very easily, and these formulas are not easily accessible and they're not easy to follow. Now I think it's probably not so hard. Whether people actually bother to do it or not, I don't know. All right, so now I'm going to set up a simple model to think about this stuff. And then I'll talk a little bit about some of the evidence. And I've already kind of sketched some of this stuff, but in terms of the evidence. But I'll get a little more explicit. So let's think about a two-period model. There's a schooling stage or an investment stage, and then there's a work stage afterwards. So investments are going to increase your earnings. So this is sort of a straight human capital framework. Investments increase your future earnings, but there's no utility, benefits, or costs, at least not yet. We'll come to that in a minute. Abstract from choice of leisure, so either you're deciding how much time to spend in school. You can think of it as a quality choice or sort of how many years I'm going to spend in school. This is just to fix ideas. So the two key characteristics that are important to think about, the one that we're going to talk most about is sort of there's some assets that people have access to. You can think of these as family assets. We're going to interpret it a lot as family income, but it's a bit tricky to think about. But you can put this in an intergenerational framework, and then you want to think about parental wealth. For now, just think of it as some individual. They've got some assets, some ability A, and they're going to maximize their lifetime utility. In their first period, their consumption is going to be whatever assets they have, less, think of this as their earnings, so they could spend H amount of time or units investing in their human capital, and basically the opportunity cost is going to be W0 times H. There's some tuition costs they have to pay for that amount of time they're going to spend, and then they can borrow, D. When they're done with school, they enter the workforce, they have some earnings, so there's a price, there's their ability, and then there's some production function for human capital, and H, this is going to be sort of an increasing concave function. And then they have to pay off their debts. This is as simple as it gets. I can't think of it. Well, you could get rid of one of these two costs, and then it would be easier, but it's going to be important for one thing I want to show you. So there's foregone wages, there's W0 being positive, there's foregone wages, and then there's also tuition costs. So if there's no credit market problems, it's a simple problem. You just maximize this subject to this, or just plug these things in and maximize that function. With respect to H and D, turns out the solution to that problem is work it out. You could do the first order conditions for that problem. It's equivalent to writing the problem in two stages. First, I choose human capital investment to maximize my lifetime income. And once I do that, I choose my borrowing and saving to smooth my consumption appropriately. So this justifies, in a lot of cases, a lot of the focus in the labor literature just focusing on income maximization. If there's no credit constraints, you could think about human capital investment decisions as just maximizing lifetime income. What your discount rate is irrelevant. Interest rates might matter, but your own personal discount rate is unimportant. That's only important to how you want to allocate your consumption in the absence of borrowing constraints. So what you can see is the optimal level of human capital has to satisfy sort of this equation, which essentially equates the marginal return on a dollar of human capital investment to the return on a dollar of savings. This is, you think of it, I'm going to call this the marginal return. It's really sort of the marginal return over the marginal cost of a unit of investment. We can think about it as a dollar, marginal return on a dollar invested. So this is sort of, it goes back to Becker. equate the marginal return on your human capital investment with that on assets if you're unconstrained. And you could sort of differentiate this thing with respect to ability, and you'll see optimal investment is increasing in ability. That's just because f is a concave function, straightforward. And you can see wealth doesn't show up anywhere in here. So family wealth is irrelevant. If you're unconstrained, it doesn't matter how much income, you just maximize your lifetime earnings, less costs, and then you allocate consumption. That clear? What is borrowing going to look like? Well, the optimal amount of borrowing is going to be decreasing in wealth. That's not terribly surprising. The more money you have, the less you would want to borrow. It's going to be increasing in ability. And that plays a bit of an important role for determining who's going to be borrowing constrained in terms of ability. But basically, why is it increasing? Why is borrowing increasing in ability? It's two reasons. One, the smarter you are, the more investment you want to make. So you want to borrow more for that. And two, even if for any given level of investment, you're going to earn more later on, and you'd like to borrow against some of that as well. So smart guys are going to want to borrow, and if you think about a fixed borrowing limit, it's going to be the smart guys. Given any wealth, the smart guys are going to be the borrowing constrained ones. Or given any level of ability, it's going to be the poor guys that are borrowing constrained.
So if we want to think of this from a family perspective, the wealthy parents,
think of it as the parental wealth. Yep. And you could set this up in an intergenerational context as long as you. We have a whole appendix that's explicit exactly about that. Qualitatively, you get exactly the same results I'm going to talk about. You can think about, and it's kind of nice. It's fairly general in terms of how you want to think about what parents care about. If in the altruistic setting, it's where they just care about your utility, it's very easy. Everything goes immediately through. But you can also think about warm glow type preferences or other types of preferences, and you almost always get exactly the kind of stuff I'm going to talk about.
So this is conditional in college, but like, should you?
No, think of this as choosing. You can think of H as choosing how many years of college you want to go to. And the quality. Right here, we're not distinguishing between quality and quantity. It's generic, but.
I'm just wondering if your outside option for going to college is also increasing your ability, right?
Well, that would be true here. I mean, that's actually important for some results, but essentially, you can think of college as just two different levels. College versus non-college is two different levels of H, human capital investment, high and a low. And ability is going to raise your earnings whether you go or not, the way we've set it up. If you want to start thinking about a world where there's a college ability and a non-college ability, some of what I'm going to say about ability is not going to hold, but everything I'm going to say about wealth and credit constraints is still going to be largely true.
I'm thinking more of like not going to college being the corner solution where H is 0.
Yeah, so well.
He's thinking of a W0 that depends on ability, so that the opportunity cost of what you're giving up by spending time on the
Yeah, he would cheated on that, partly because.
But I mean, in the data, we know that the gap between W1 and W0 is growing in ability, and so it makes sense to simplify by saying W0 just doesn't depend on ability at all, and W1 does, since the gap is increasing in ability.
Well, it's a little bit. I mean, I did something a little tricky here because of one result I want to show you, but it's not that important in general. Because I distinguish between a price for your human cap, well, what your sort of wage rate when you're young and in college age. Here I don't have it depending on ability. That's true. Whereas here, your earnings afterwards do depend on ability regardless. I mean, you'd want to have H. You want to think about two levels of H that are non-zero. Otherwise, it's not. I mean, you wouldn't have to, I suppose, but.
I think about this result as exactly one and it's the same, conditional on choosing that you want to be in a place where you can gather human capital. The optimal level of human capital that you want to gather is going to be increasing in ability, right? And then kind of like, if we zoom out of that and say you can either choose to be in an environment where you can accumulate human capital, or you can choose to be in an environment where you just go on your own. Let's say you do a star. Then it could be that your outside option is also increasing ability too. So for those guys who are on the extensive margin, into or not to do different. So you get
Yeah, so what's true here, what's implicit here, well, I don't know, it's implicit or explicit, but your ability, people that make more investments, ability is going to have a bigger payoff for it. So that's why I say you could start thinking about worlds where I could think about as an ability, in the world where I don't go to college, that may be distinct and not that correlated with the ability when I do go to college. And then I'd have to be much more careful about which ability I want to talk about. Here is this one ability, and if your ability's up, you're going to earn more no matter what you do. But you're going to, your return on your investment is going to be higher if you're more able. That's the way ability is basically defined here.
I have a question. Do you know anything about survey data about people being asked what is your primary reason for going to college? Do many people answer it's because they want to increase my lifetime income, or do some people say, well, I think it's possible to be able, or maybe more people are positive? I was wondering if it would change because if let's say I really want to be together with smart people, and that's the only thing I derive from from. Actually, I don't care about my consumption at all. Maybe this would mean that you can increase college people indefinitely. I was always somehow try to pay them from whatever source because I don't actually count my lifetime income, but it's going to be
Yeah, I mean, we could introduce, and I'll do that in a few minutes, introduce tastes. You know, I like human capital, I like going to school, or I don't like going to school. I don't think people have, I mean, there are surveys that will ask probably questions about why you're going or not. I never know what to make of those things because usually people answer lots of reasons. And if they say your primary reason, what does that mean? Does that mean the other one doesn't matter? So I think, I mean, people have tried to, I mean, if you want to explain schooling decisions conditional on, say, observable measures of ability, there's going to be a wide range of choices people make that are going to be hard to explain without appealing to some sort of other reason that and one of the explanations is, well, I like the cheap sort of way economists treat it is, oh, there's a taste for school. Some guys like it, some guys don't. They don't get so much into what type of schools they like to go to, although I guess that's partly because people haven't modeled that much the choice of all different types of schools. But it's not that, I'll show you in a second we can introduce that, and that it actually undoes a lot of the nice, clean results that come out of this. And then we could talk about how that means we should interpret what we observe empirically. But I want to be explicit about the sort of the standard framework, and then I'm going to sort of say we can add wrinkles to it and think about what that does. Yeah, so I should end around 12:30? Okay, all right, perfect. So now what happens if we just add a very simple borrowing constraint? You can't borrow more than D bar. Well, as I said, we could figure out who's borrowing constrained by basically looking at investment. We said borrowing is increasing in ability and decreasing in wealth. We could figure out basically an asset threshold that would, if your wealth is below that threshold, you're going to be constrained. And if your wealth is above that threshold, you're going to be unconstrained. And that threshold is increasing in ability. That's basically sort of the flip side of what I was saying before, is that more able guys are going to be the ones more likely to be constrained given any level of wealth, because they want to borrow a lot. The dumb guy that's not going to get anything out of school, he doesn't really want to borrow much because he doesn't have much to smooth. The smart kid is going to have a lot down the road, and he's going to want to smooth that. This gets back to something we already covered. It's really, this makes it very clear that borrowing, you might need more wealth than, being unconstrained may require more wealth than just covering the costs. So just knowing whether people have enough money to pay the tuition bill is not enough to know whether someone's borrowing constrained. Obviously, if they don't have enough money, then they're going to be constrained. But people that have enough money still might be constrained because they want to do some consumption smoothing. It's not fun to live live in a crappy place and eat awful food. Although I guess as a student, it's not
quite as bad. Exactly. It's not fun, I said, but. What happens? Well, you can, if you just sort of solve the maximization problem from before, where you just add this constraint, you get a sort of Lagrange multiplier here. You could solve the two first order conditions. You put those together, and you get out something now that looks like the marginal return on investment now equals the return on savings plus some positive amount that depends on the Lagrange multiplier. So now immediately you get out the marginal return on human capital investment has to exceed the return on savings. People often ask, what if you sort of wrote constraints down as people face different interest rates? That's the way Becker does it. People face different interest rates, the way Cameron and Tabor do it, versus there's a hard limit on borrowing. Turns out, I mean, when you get to this expression, you see you're going to get something very similar out. Basically, this problem where there's a borrowing limit is just like saying if people are up against that borrowing limit, they're facing a higher interest rate. You could have written the problem down where they face this interest rate here, and that would have been giving you the same investment allocations as otherwise. So in terms of understanding human capital investment, you can go back and forth between these two models pretty easily. I think thinking about the hard borrowing limit's kind of nice. When we get to world with uncertainty, and you start thinking about what banks would do or optimal contracts would do, you're going to often have a combination of these two, where there's going to be interest rates, they're going to be a function of how much you want to borrow, but they'd also maybe a hard limit on how much you could borrow. You could think of this case as a limiting case where the interest rate's constant and then goes to infinity at some point if you want to borrow more than d bar. I just wanted to draw this sort of link between these two. An easier way to think about a lot of results is to just sort of plug in the constraint on borrowing and then think about, what's the first order condition where we just choose the amount of investment. And you get out some equation like this. It's nothing to focus on too much. But the key is that optimal constrained investment, if the borrowing constraint binds, now investment has to sort of plays a dual role where it didn't before. It has to balance this objective of trying to maximize your lifetime income, but at the same time it determines how you allocate that income over time. If I want to take some more of that money today, the only way I can do it if I'm up against my borrowing limit is by investing less. So it's sort of this tension between wanting to borrow more to increase my lifetime income and wanting to invest more to increase my total, think about it as the total pie that you have to choose between. But now I'm restricting how you allocate that pie depending on how you make those investment choices. Whereas in the unconstrained world, you just maximize the pie and you're free to allocate it across periods however you want. So this is nice because you could sort of differentiate this with respect to ability or wealth or anything else you might, opportunity cost, tuition cost, et cetera, to say how do these factors affect how much people invest. And that's really where the whole sort of empirical literature is based on, essentially thinking about this equation versus our equation for unconstrained investment. So what is the empirical literature? Largely focuses on a couple of things. Empirically, you can't really test this too much, but this sort of drives a lot of everything. Constrained individuals, it's easy to see they're going to underinvest in their human capital. So a constrained investment is always less than unconstrained investment if the constraint binds. Unconstrained investment is independent of wealth. And on the other hand, if people are borrowing constrained, that investment should be increasing in wealth as well as the borrowing limit. This is sort of a large literature and looks at essentially this prediction, looking at income gradients and do kids from high-income families versus low-income families invest more in their education. Conditional on ability. This is sort of conditional on ability. This result says this is what we should observe in this kind of world. The flip side of that, basically these are sort of twin implications of the same result. The marginal return on human capital investment, that's this thing I was showing you before. If you're unconstrained, it should equal the return on savings. So whatever the appropriate interest rate is, that should be what the marginal return on investment should be, sort of returns to schooling measures. On the other hand, it should be strictly greater than the return on savings and decreasing in wealth if you're borrowing constrained. So there's a different sort of literature that kind of looks at that. Card's sort of handbook chapter kind of talks a lot about this. Cameron and Tabor are a little bit more explicit. They actually move down to something more related to this. And that is, you also get this interesting result that if borrowing constraints, if there's no constraints, then investment responds equally to raising opportunity costs or tuition costs. Doesn't matter, a cost is a cost. But if you're borrowing constraint, that's not true. Actually, if you increase the direct costs of schooling, that's going to have cause a larger reduction in investment than increasing in opportunity costs. So now you get an asymmetry between opportunity costs and direct costs. And that's ultimately what Cameron and Tabor are about, and I'll tell you a little bit about later. So the first three are all kind of basically go back to Becker. And it's basically the fact that it's all coming off that first order condition for investment. The last one is something Cameron and Tabor sort of point out. And in this simple model, it's a little bit different in their model. They have a model where you choose to go to college or not, so it's a discrete choice. You get kind of the same result, though. Intuition's a little bit different, but you get the same result. Here the intuition is increasing opportunity costs in some sense increases your full wealth as well. So it's increasing and that has a sort of an effect on your behavior, whereas increasing direct costs doesn't. So here it's this W naught. So if you just want to see the math, basically W naught shows up twice. Tuition costs only show up once. And it's not surprising then the derivative with respect to those two is going to be different. The intuition is probably actually easier in the choice where you choose college versus non-college. It's basically whether you get the money in a state where you have low wealth versus whether you pay the costs in a state where you have low wealth or a state where you have higher wealth. And that's sort of the difference between those two in that context. There's this weird result that comes out. Let me skip over that. I'm going to run out of time for sure. So I'm not going to cover everything I want today, so we'll might as well scuttle something already.
So this seems kind of like a model that tells me why if I'm a high ability person I should, borrow or go to my borrowing limit to go to Yale instead of community college or something like that. But the graph you showed us at the beginning told us that the borrowing limit is less than the cost of college. So it's almost, if we think of two H's, a 0 and some H bar, it's like there's an H bar and tau times H bar is bigger than the borrowing limit. So it's like, I don't know if this is the right margin to be thinking about borrowing constraint people in terms of the data you showed us at the beginning. It's almost like, is the capital W big enough to cover tau times H bar? It's more of a appropriate one.
What are you saying? The data up front says what? That the borrowing's not enough to cover.
You said tuition is higher than the borrowing limit, right? So tau times H bar is bigger than P. So it's really, then the difference is, do I have enough capital W at the beginning of life to cover the difference or not?
No, but it's more than that. You still want smooth. I think you still want to think about smoothing. That even if I have enough W to cover the W plus my borrowing, I could still cover my costs. I still want to think about smoothing. I don't want to live on nothing while I'm at school.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm just trying to say that there's another potential case where a borrowing constraint can bond here than where you have like a continuous choice on H and how big is H.
You could write this problem down as a discrete choice problem. There's two levels of H. You're just going to, in that problem, you're going to get everything in terms of probabilities of going. And you need some other thing that varies across. Well, you would have either a discrete threshold where people would go or not, or you can add in some sort of taste for schooling like this, and then you're just going to get the probabilities, and they're all going to behave in the way I talk about. So nothing I talk about, that stuff's not that
The discrete versus continuous is not very important for anything I'm talking about so far. What's going to be more relevant is if there's other motives for going to college or going to school. So if you add in, so I'm going to tell you, you get these nice clean results in sort of the pure investment model. As soon as you add in some sort of other reasons people go, so they like school or they don't like school, all of these a lot of these nice results just go out the window. Or at least you can get kind of anything you want depending on what you think this taste is. So if this taste is positive, so people like school, then unconstrained investment is going to be increasing in family income. Higher income families just buy more of it because they like it. And the marginal return is going to be less than the return on savings. On the other hand, if they don't like school, you get the opposite. So in terms of right away, boom, you just see sort of the whole empirical literature that focuses on these two main results is not sensitive. It completely goes out the window as soon as you start saying, well, tastes might be out there. And people might like school or don't. If we don't know how much they like it or not, it's hard to sort of derive these clean predictions. Interestingly, this sort of last result of the asymmetry of costs actually still holds, even in this environment. So potentially, that's maybe a more robust way to start thinking about some of this stuff. So we're going to talk about some of the other thing I wanted to say is what I think is a little bit more, it makes some value of some of this stuff. We could still think a little bit about it, and then let me wrap up for lunch, let you guys eat some lunches. One of the big things we've seen is the returns to college have gone up dramatically over time. So the question is, can we learn something about it, constraints potentially from that? And if there's no borrowing constraints, and you suppose now you just think about there's a discrete choice, you go to college or you don't, so there's two levels of H. And there's heterogeneity in these tastes. Well, you can map out the probability of people going to college for different levels of wealth and human capital. And you can write down other versions of the model, but it's very simple in that framework. What you find is that anything that increases the returns to college should weaken the relationship between wealth and college attendance, or make it more negative, actually. What's going on is if you increase the monetary value of college, who is that most valuable to? People with very low wealth, because of diminishing marginal returns to utility, consumption. The high wealth guys, that's not very valuable. They're going to school because they like it or not. But the low wealth guys are going to get more value out of that. So who would you expect to respond more to an increase in the return? Financial returns, you'd expect the lower wealth guys to go. So one nice prediction that comes out of it, I think that's kind of testable, is sort of how important, in a world without borrowing constraints, it's actually hard to explain the fact that over time the family income gradient got a lot steeper, where the model in general, because of diminishing returns to consumption, suggests it should have flattened. If borrowing constraints are there and they bind, you can actually get that result, because even if the returns go up a lot, if I'm poor, it's too costly for me to take advantage of that because I have to live on nothing for a while, whereas the higher wealth guys can take advantage of that at no cost. So a model with borrowing constraints can potentially explain that. Whether that's the only explanation or not, I don't know. It's actually not. Then there's a few other margins that we'll talk about after lunch. What would you expect constrained guys? You'd expect distortions on their consumption. They're going to consume very little. There's all kinds of margins they might play with besides just not going. They might work more while in school. They might delay college entry. Might go to lower quality schools or lower price schools, which makes this whole wage returns relationship a bit trickier. If you're constrained, you might have lower returns to college because you go to lower quality schools. Whereas sort of in the simpler framework, they should have a higher marginal return on their investment. So I'll talk, after lunch, I'll talk about some of the evidence related to this stuff. And then we'll go a little bit over early versus late borrowing constraints. I'll have to revise what I was going to do there. And then I'll talk about more interesting models of borrowing constraints where we actually think about where they come from. Sorry, I took an extra 5.